Okay. Hi, my name is Eli Zinner. I'm going to be giving a presentation on a study that looked at how tall poppy syndrome affected workplace performance. This study was conducted by Kuntz in 2015 in New Zealand. A slight overview of the presentation. We're going to start with an introduction, which is going to give some history as to what tall poppy syndrome is and where it came from, the method of the study, as well as the results, and then a discussion and a conclusion. I'm waiting forward to change the slides on my computer. I hope you can follow along as I go. So, starting with what tall poppy syndrome is. Tall poppy syndrome is described as a phenomenon in Australasia that refers to the criticizing and attacking of high-achieving individuals to cut down and normalize them to the rest of the population. There is another working definition that I think is important. It's defined in the New Zealand Oxford Dictionary as a conspicuously successful person whose distinction attracts envy or hostility. So this is a social phenomenon that essentially leads others to have a negative viewpoint of somebody who is high achieving, be it in work, school, sports, or any of the places where people seek achievement. The current study looked to examine the effect of this tall poppy syndrome on workplace performance specifically. So a little bit more historical relevance on tall poppy syndrome. It was first studied by N.T. Feather in 1987 here in Southern Australia to examine the attitude towards tall poppies in the high school setting. He later that year conducted a similar study to view university students and their views of tall poppy syndrome, whether or not it was positive or negative. And then 2 years after this, he created the tall poppy scale in 1989. This scale consisted of 20 items. It helped to determine whether the attitudes of a participant may have been positive and or negative towards the tall poppy. Half of the items would reflect negative, half of them would reflect positive. The scale was designed to be as general as possible to be able to cover a wide range of contexts as well as people. A little bit more into New Zealand's history and kind of theories standing around where tall poppy syndrome would have come from. New Zealand has been an egalitarian governing body, so egalitarianism is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as believing in or based on the principle that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and opportunities. This kind of had an effect in the social groups and social views of the people in New Zealand as it was created and sustained over the last, well, since its inception. This creates kind of attitudes where people are more likely to be modest as well as express humility instead of kind of bolstering themselves and celebrating their achievements. It creates this self-deprecation within groups. This allows them to level themselves to the middle of the pack, be seen as one of peers and not somebody who's standing out. This effect definitely limits people's ability to reach their full potential, not pushing themselves to be greater than others. So within the current study, there were 7 different hypotheses. The first hypothesis was that perceived negative attitudes towards tall poppies in the workplace will decrease decision-making vigilance. The second hypothesis is that negative attitude perception in the workplace will decrease decision-making dependability. The third hypothesis is that perceived negative attitudes towards the tall poppy in the workplace will increase decision-making avoidance. The fourth hypothesis is that the perceived negative attitude in the workplace will decrease creativity. Hypothesis 5 is that the perceived negative attitude in the workplace will decrease problem solving. Hypothesis 6, perceived negative attitudes towards tall poppies in the workplace will decrease internal service quality. And hypothesis 7 is that the negative attitude perception towards the tall poppies will also decrease in need for affiliation. So the method of this study is a cross-sectional design that implemented a survey. After analysis of all of the survey data was completed, the number of participants left was 229, with 118 being female, with a mean age of 39 years old. 111 of the participants were working males with a mean age of 44, and the job tenure for women was an average of 46 months, with men being 56 months. The sampling method used was a haphazard sampling method. This is to create non-statistical randomization, and to make sure that everybody was relevant to the study, the recruiting networks were LinkedIn and Facebook, LinkedIn being primarily used for work and achieving work or communicating with people in your workplace environment or similar occupation, and Facebook was used because it's the largest social media network with an estimated 2 million users in New Zealand alone. Okay, so materials and scales. All of the scales used were 5-point Likert scales. The first performance measuring decision making was created by Leggett and DeBreeze. Larger scale would indicate more avoidance. Affiliation and achievement was created by Heckert et al. A higher score would be more need for achievement as well as affiliation. The problem-solving scale was developed by Hepner and Peterson, and a larger score would indicate more confidence. Creativity scale was created by Zhao and George. A higher score would indicate more creativity, and the service quality scale was created by Boshoff and Mills, and a higher score would indicate higher internal service quality. So to continue with the procedure, participants were informed that the survey was to measure workplace attitudes. On the first page of the survey, you would see consent information and options to either continue or not. The entire survey took about 7 to 25 minutes to complete, and upon completion, there was no follow-up or debriefing with anybody who had taken the survey. As for results, the tall poppy scale indicated 2 scores, one of which being favoring a fall and the other favoring reward towards that tall poppy. The fall had a mean score of 2.6, while the reward had a mean score of 3.3. The independent variables being age, tenure, as well as number of colleagues interacted with were all positive job influence. So the dependent scales would be the vigilance, dependability, avoidance in the decision making, and then creativity, problem solving, and internal service quality. So moving on to individual results. Hypothesis 1 was the vigilance. Achievement and tenure were both seen to be significant predictors of decision-making vigilance, while tall poppy syndrome was non-significant as a predictor. Age was also a predictor that had a negative relationship with vigilance, but because there was non-statistical relevance for tall poppy syndrome, this hypothesis was not supported. Hypothesis 2 was dependability. Tall poppy syndrome and age were both seen to be significant predictors, and this would suggest that a negative attitude would be more likely to seek advice. So dependability was supported significantly by tall poppy syndrome as a predictor. Hypothesis 3 was avoidance. Tall poppy syndrome was a significant predictor, while people who are experiencing high achieving were more likely to avoid decision making. So those who are higher achievers would be likely to avoid decision making, most likely due to the fact that they are already perceived as somebody who's standing out of the pack. Therefore, decision making avoidance would help them to keep themselves in the middle. Okay, hypothesis 4, creativity. So age was positively associated with creativity. So people who were older were more creative, while people who were more likely to pursue achievement were also more creative. But tall poppy syndrome and tenure were seen to be non-significant, therefore creativity was not supported. Hypothesis 5 was problem solving. Achievement was the only significant predictor of problem solving, while higher need to achieve would give people more confidence to problem solve, although tall poppy syndrome was not seen to be a predictor that was significant, so the hypothesis was not supported. Hypothesis 6, internal service quality. Achievement was significant as a predictor. Tall poppy syndrome was close to being at 0.06, but in the end was not, so therefore internal service quality hypothesis was also not supported. And last, hypothesis 7, affiliation. People who were higher to achieve showed a significant in prediction and a positive relationship, although tall poppy syndrome was not, and therefore the hypothesis was not supported. Okay, moving on to the discussion. The purpose of this study was to find whether working in an environment that was perceived to favor the fall of the tall poppy over rewarding the tall poppy affected workplace performance, employee performance in the designated hypotheses. The result of this study supported hypothesis 2 and decrease in decision-making dependability due to the high view of the tall poppy syndrome. Hypothesis 3, an increase in decision-making avoidance. And hypothesis 6, which was partially confirmed, leaving still a non-significant result. Results indicated that employees working in the environment that favored the fall of the tall poppy lowered decision-making dependability. So analysis of creativity, problem-solving, decision-making vigilance, and a need for affiliation all saw no significant effects when compared to the view of the tall poppy syndrome, or the tall poppy. This study does not come without limitations. It is not really possible to tell if the tall poppy environment affected participant behavior. It's only possible to theorize about possible associations. So, because there are so many different working environments and career, I don't know how the best way to put this is, sorry. There's a large difference in workplace environment, and simply the view of a positive or negative idealization of the tall poppy is not enough to confirm the results of this study. There are too many factors as well as too many people to say whether or not these were direct. It can only be inferred that what was measured is measured correctly. Again, another limitation of measurements would be that all of these measures were self-reported, so social desirability becomes a large impact, especially when talking about tall poppy syndrome. If it's desirable to be not a tall poppy and not perceived as high achieving, then it's most definitely going to affect any of the data given to them, because people, without thinking about it, are already being affected by this idea of tall poppy syndrome, so it's affecting the data that is already coming in. And then lastly, as mentioned before, it's difficult for the researchers to reach participants because there was no debriefing after they had taken the surveys. So anybody who was a participant is essentially gone to the wind, and they have no way to follow up any of the information that they've collected from any individual participants. In conclusion, the results of this study show that the tall poppy syndrome attitudes were associated with some negative work outcomes as predicted, but others not so much. The independent and dependent variables varied across each hypothesis and which was affecting what outcome. But most importantly, what was looked at was the attitude towards tall poppy and the individual dependent variables. Few seem to be immune from tall poppy syndrome. It seems to be that if you're living in a culture that is affected by the tall poppy syndrome or has any inclination to be affected by tall poppy syndrome, it's going to affect everybody. Whether or not they're aware of it or not, there is going to be an interplay between how people perceive themselves and perceive others with this idea that if you are going to be somebody who's achieving, it's going to reflect negatively upon you, which is never a desirable feeling for anybody. The effects it may have on workplace behavior, motivation, attitude should be studied further. There are very few studies on tall poppy syndrome since its inception, and like any beginnings of its theorization on how it affects people socially, there's very little information. Any information that is found within Australia and New Zealand. Any testing that's been done have been within those two countries, and it's very minimal. So there needs to be an expansion of research that's looking into how exactly tall poppy syndrome, whether positive or negative, is affecting all social constructs, whether it be sports, education, work, or anything like that. Thanks, I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, I don't know, I'm happy to answer them in class. Sorry, I know this is non-conventional. I hope that you and your family were safe during the storm, and thanks for listening. I look forward to writing the literature review.